Good morning, Finovate. So most of us would have authenticated something on our mobile phone in the last couple of hours. It could be a transaction, a payment, maybe logging into a mobile app. But not many of us thought about the architecture, the regulations, or anything behind it, because that's the beauty of authentication. When it works, it just works fine. It's invisible. Nobody thinks about it. But when do we actually think about it is when there is friction. There is a change. Talking about change, authentication is at one of those stages where it's moving on to the next level. That is post-quantum authentication, which just means that authentication that can not only withstand today's threats, but tomorrow's quantum threats as well. Which brings me to my topic. So how do we make this shift? Move from current legacy authentication infrastructure to a quantum-safe security architecture with the least amount of friction, without still being invisible to our customers. So timing in cybersecurity, it's an uncomfortable topic, right? If you move too fast, then suddenly your investment is questioned. And if you move too slow, then you're just chasing deadlines. You're rushing to finish deadlines. But with post-quantum authentication, what we have is a unique window. It's not too fast, not too slow. What we do know is regulators are signaling this change in that direction. And customer expectations are moving towards passwordless journeys. And cryptography is evolving a lot faster than the identity systems they were designed for. So authentication is no longer a background component. It is what is shaping the overall digital experience and the security posture. This is why conversations like this need to happen now. If you look at the analyst reports, we have a window of about 4 to 8 years before everything needs to be post-quantum safe. See, but when we speak to banks, except a very few forward-thinking banks, the conversation sounds very different. See, we understand that. It's not because it's a simple switch. Like, nobody wakes up on a Monday morning and decides to just go ahead and replace authentication. It is tied very closely to a bunch of factors. It's tied to regulations, tied to user experience. And also the fact that the current stack somehow just still works kind of fine. So why change something when it's already working, right? Seems kind of risky. So what we also see is that when you look at the current stacks, there's layers and layers of components, right? There's a mobile login that was added, let's say, 5 years ago. And that sits next to maybe a Webflow login that was added 10 years ago, and maybe sits next to a partner API that nobody wants to touch because it still handles millions of transactions. So this layering, it creates a stability, but it also creates inertia. So post-quantum readiness is not a single migration path. It's an architectural evolution. So we need to look at it that way. So the earlier we start shaping that evolution, the more freedom we'll have at the end without being forced to, let's say, do a lot of forced redesigns. So I have here the Gartner hype cycle from last year. We can see that post-quantum authentication already entered the roadmap. And by the way, we are mentioned by Gartner as one of the sample vendors. We're proud of that. The shift we see here is not just a shift in algorithms. It's a shift in how we think about trust over time. See, authentication used to be based on moments. You log in, you prove who you are, and that moment is secure. But now, digital experiences are not based on moments. They last longer. They last for years. So, because devices persist, digital identities evolve, so authentication is no longer a checkpoint. It's what defines the period of trust now And also, it has to make sense tomorrow. The decisions we make on authentication, it still has to make sense tomorrow because of that long-term window. So the question here is our authentication secure? That's not the question. The question should be, can it evolve without causing friction to our users? And that brings quantum into the picture. See, quantum comes in not as a hype or a scared tactic or a threat. It's more of a practical roadmap. Because all the roadmaps assume that the traditional asymmetric cryptography we use currently, they will be obsolete in, let's say, the next 4 years, 5 years. We know that it has to evolve within this decade. So that puts us into a new risk, which means attackers don't have to break our systems today. They can harvest our data and decrypt it later as technology becomes available. So now suddenly, authentication has an even longer exposure window. So when we decide to make changes on cryptography, it doesn't mean we have to force your customers to change over. Now, another misconception is that moving early means moving too fast. But in reality, moving early allows you to move slowly and intelligently, because once you start chasing the deadlines, the timeline compresses, and authentication suddenly becomes a crisis than a strategic initiative. Because at that point, teams will start pushing for different things. Security wants to push for better, stronger controls. Product would want to reduce customer friction, and leadership wants rapid results. What happens then? That's the point where you start optimizing for speed and not long-term resiliency. So that's a different part. So starting early can change this dynamic completely, right? Starting early will allow your team to have enough time to test, pilot, learn, experiment, etc. So moving on to the next part. So once banks would accept that it is in fact a switch and not, it's in fact an evolution, not a switch, then the question is, okay, so where do we start? See, if you look at the most successful transition over the last couple of years, they all follow a similar pattern, a sequence. So having the right ignition steps, we call it, they're not a checklist or a transformation program. We call it ignition steps, because what they will do is they would allow you to have that, reduce that uncertainty before you reduce risks. So the idea here is to create that momentum without disruption by having ignition steps. Talking about ignition steps, the first one is, of course, visibility. Many organizations tend to think they know their authentication stack pretty well until they fully map it, because it's rarely a single system, right? What we see is a collection of journeys. It could be mobile, Webflow, internal access, partner integrations, and everything sort of assumes or reflects a security assumptions of that particular time it was built. So having the visibility will allow your teams to understand which journeys can evolve, which can remain stable for a longer period. But if you don't have that visibility, the post-quantum readiness will stay theoretical. Having visibility, it's not going to make any immediate changes to security, but what it does, it gives you clarity. And clarity is what's going to help you with the next few steps. Now, stakeholder buy-in. Authentication is rarely owned by a single team, right? We have multiple teams working towards it. Security would work with focus on threat models. We have product working at overall customer experience. And we have compliance focused on auditability, regulations. But historically, this perspective can often collide. Because the shift we're seeing with authentication now is that it's treated as a major part of the overall product experience. So having buyer alignment early on in the process will make your architectural decisions look more intentional and less defensive. Regulations, a favorite one. So, of course, most of us look at regulation as a deadline or a pressure situation, right? But we should be looking at it as a directive, a signal. Because if you look at PSD3, DORA, EIDAS 2.0, none of these mandate like specific technological changes. What they do, in fact, is prescribe outcomes. It could be diversification, it could be long-term trust, resilience. So that distinction is very important. Once you understand that, or you work towards that distinction, what happens is then banks will get time to design and not just to comply. So treating regulations as a roadmap and not a deadline will allow banks to have time. And time enables better user experience. I mean, if you forgot everything I said today, these are 5 words I like you to remember. Time enables better user experience. In this context, we know that, we understand. Now we have regulators pointing towards that post-quantum journey. And if you act early, you have the time to design the best user experience. But if you want to wait until it's a deadline, then the shift has already happened. Migration paths. Another misconception that we like to think it as authentication transitions follow a single migration path. But most of the most successful ones follow parallel paths. You want to onboard new customers into a modern system. Existing customers can evolve gradually. And maybe the high-risk journeys can transform, evolve before the low-risk one. So the idea is to offer that parallel path to reduce customer friction wherever we can, right? So obviously, at some point, these paths are going to converge. But when they converge, is not causing any friction. There's no signs of a forced migration. We're doing it parallelly. So like I said in the beginning of the session, right? We only notice it when there is change or friction. So we don't want that to happen for a smoother transition. Now, execution is where everything gets tested and where most of the transformation efforts fail or quietly fail. It's not because they didn't have the right strategy. It's because they didn't match the tempo of the organization. It's because when people feel change, there is friction. And when they don't, trust grows. So successful executions always happen quietly. Pilots can run without fanfare. Metrics can be measured even before any decisions are scaled. So crypto agility. That's one of those terms you will hear a lot in the next few years, is crypto agility. Sounds technical, rather abstract, but in fact, it is a business question. And the question is, how expensive is change? Because if you look at the current infrastructure, authentication is deeply embedded into user journey. So when there is any change in algorithms, we can see that the teams are not just swapping libraries. They're redesigning onboarding flows. They're restructuring, re-engineering mobile apps. They're retraining security teams. See, that's not a cryptography problem. That is an architectural problem. So crypto agility is when you can separate that trust logic from user experience. When standards evolve, we know they always do. It could be post-quantum algorithms now. It could be something else we haven't even named in the future. But whatever it is, we should be able to upgrade security without asking millions of our customers to change behavior. So the banks that understand this early, they do not look at security as a series of upgrades. They look at it as a living system that adapts over time. Just to summarize on the steps we talked about. So visibility, stakeholder buy-in early on, choose the migration paths, design and execute crypto agility standards. I've got a QR code here. If you scan it, you can actually download the whole ignition guide from our website. So post-quantum authentication these days always comes as a risk conversation, right? Oh, what is a threat? What can we prevent? What is the risk? It doesn't have to be, because it's not just cryptography at stake here. It's the decisions that's shaping the digital trust of tomorrow. Because the banks that understand this early on, they gain the architectural freedom, the flexibility, time to innovate, and they don't have to redesign their authentication every few years. So in a digital economy, trust is a competitive advantage. And authentication, if done right, is not just a strategic layer. It's actually a digital asset, a strategic digital asset. So our team would be at booth number 9, just down the corner there. We'll be genuinely interested to know where you are or where your organizations are in this journey. Because authentication for tomorrow is not shaped by one company like Wultra or one regulation. It will be shaped by the decisions we make collectively starting today. Thank you.